but it sure looks like the Obama Justice Department got a pretty serious package of black eyes last week when not one, but two high-profile cases that they brought, one against some people in the Chris Christie administration, one against Michael Flynn, were both thrown out effectively. In fact, the Chris Christie Bridgegate was thrown out at the Supreme Court in a 9-0 decision, which rarely happens. But that does not exonerate them from facing civil charges. And one of the guys who knows more about civil charges than anyone, Professor John Banzhaf, joins us right now. He is a public interest attorney and professor at George Washington University and George Washington University Law. And Frank Morano joins me again. Professor, how are you?
I'm doing fine, John. And all this started back in the mid-1990s when some group, to make some kind of point, decided to block all of the cars coming off the major bridge from Virginia to D.C. So literally hundreds of people were trapped in their cars. Nothing really ever happened to the demonstrators. And I said, no, that's wrong. If they're not going to face criminal liability, they should face civil liability. And since then, what I've been advocating, and it's been done, is that people who deliberately block bridges or roads or whatever and literally trap people in their cars, even if they escape criminal liability or they pay a small fine, should be sued civilly. Because the law allows any person, any one person trapped in their car, to bring a class action against any one of the dozen or 24, whatever, demonstrators. They can go after those demonstrators, any one of them, for the entire damages, say 200 cars, $100 an hour, and they can then go after that one person and basically get a judgment against him and garnish his wages for probably the rest of his life. And that might deter people, even though the risk of a small fine doesn't seem to work.
Professor Banzhaf, this is Frank. It's great to talk with you again. It's always a real pleasure to hear from you. You are probably one of the most quoted law professors in the country and one of the most quoted experts on torts in the country. You proposed this at the time this occurred. I'm curious, obviously this has been pending a while, waiting to see what was going to happen with the criminal case, but I'm curious, what's been the reaction from any potential plaintiffs to your proposal, if any? Has anybody come out and say, yeah, you know what, I was inconvenienced. It did take me an extra 2 hours to drop my child off at school. It was the day before September 11th. I am curious, about exploring this. Have you heard from any potential plaintiffs on this?
Well, I'll go further. I think my analysis of the situation and my encouragement as to how to bring a lawsuit actually encouraged 2 lawsuits to be brought by those very people who were inconvenienced. One of them I know is still going on. I don't know about the other. But there have also been other situations when a group, anti-whaling for some reason, decided to disrupt some whaling out on some ocean. They thought nothing would happen. They got hit with a $2.5 million judgment, which they had to pay. There was a student who, for example, chained himself up to some construction equipment. He didn't want a pipeline built. And according to NPR, he's perfectly willing to pay the very small fine, trespassing. But when they hit him with a $39,000 judgment, that made him think a little bit. And there were some protesters out in Bloomington. They tried to close down or disrupt the mall, and they got sued and sued plenty. So this has happened. It can happen. And I think if more situations, people actually did bring the lawsuits, I think you'd have a strong deterrent effect. Because the fines don't deter these guys. Sure. They know they go out there, they're going to get some street cred, they're going to promote their cause, maybe meet some pretty girls, and okay, they pay a $50 fine. But if they're facing a $100,000 class action lawsuit with punitive damages on top of it, and they got to spend a couple $100,000 on attorney's fees, hey, they might think again, twice, 3 times.
Let me ask you as well about this new policy on college campuses that the Department of Education has put out there regarding sexual harassment and sex assault. What exactly is the new policy, and is this in effect, assuming kids are ever able to go back to college campuses, is this in effect right now?
Okay, it's not in effect right now. It will be going into effect in the middle of August. The policy requiring individual colleges and universities to investigate claims or complaints about campus rape has been going on now for about at least 5 years. There are major problems with it, and this new rule basically changes some of the parameters. It requires, for example, due process. It requires that there be a hearing.
Imagine that.
Yeah, imagine that. Judges have been saying it for years. Now the federal government is saying it. It got rid of the old, what we call single investigator rule, where one guy on campus, or one gal usually, would both investigate the allegation, and then they'd make the judgment. So your judge and jury and everything all rolled into one. But what I did, and I proposed an alternative solution, which the Department of Education has now adopted and is encouraging, gets colleges out of all of this. Because no matter what they do, whenever they investigate, they have an inherent conflict of interest. The people on our campuses simply are not qualified to conduct major felony investigations, whether it's a rape or a murder or an assault with a deadly weapon. They just can't do it. They barely handle water balloon fights. And then it's amateur hour when they try to hold their own hearings. And in time after time, the courts have struck down these hearings. I mean, how would you like to be tried by the volleyball coach and the assistant dean for parking and a couple of students thrown in and the professor of Slavic languages? I mean, you don't want that.
Well,
So your proposal, which the Department of Education has now adopted, it provides due process opportunities.
Well, what it does is it says, let's get colleges and universities out of the business of doing it themselves. Let's have what they call regional centers. Everybody, for example, in the Washington, D.C. area, some 24 colleges would get together. They'd form an independent, tax-exempt organization. They'd hire an executive director. They'd hire one or two highly skilled, highly specialized sex crime investigators, the SVU type people, and all of the complaints would be funneled to them. They are not going to be biased. They don't care whether the university is found liable or not liable. They have tremendous experience. They have no bias. And the hearings would be held not by our volleyball coach and professor of Slavic languages, but by retired judges or retired prosecutors or defense attorneys who know the ins and outs of holding hearings and who would guarantee fairness and due process to everybody involved. It's so simple. I would think that every college university would love to get out of the business of having to investigate and then adjudicate all of these complaints. Some of them are spending over $1 million a year per college setting up these offices, staffing them, running the process. Who wants to be involved in that?
Professor, this is John. I got to ask you, but somewhere in there, don't you think the universities liked having the control over the process and the information flow so they can kind of limit their reputational damage? So are universities pushing back against this, or is it a mandate?
Well, that's the whole problem. That's why there's an inherent conflict of interest. On the one hand, they have a strong desire, strong pressure to suppress any such things, not to find anybody guilty. They don't want to be known as rape you. They don't want co-eds scared of coming to the college. On the other hand, they have increased pressure now from activist groups who hold demonstrations, who file complaints with the federal government. Nobody wants to be the subject of federal complaint. So if they find the guy guilty or responsible, as we call it, or not guilty, not responsible, one side or the other always screams bias, conflict of interest. But if the whole thing is conducted by an independent regional consortium or center, as they call it, there is no bias. There is no built-in conflict of interest. The people who are doing the investigation are not, some cop on our campus who can barely handle a drunken brawl, much less a sensitive investigation. And when the hearings are held, it's held by people who are highly experienced, retired judges, retired lawyers who have no interest whatsoever in the outcome. They don't want to shield anybody. They don't want to protect against complaints. They are completely unbiased. I think it's a win-win-win-win for everybody, the universities, the women complaining about it, and the guys who are the respondents.
Wow. All right. Well, Professor, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a win-win-win-win-win when you join us on Liquid Lunch. And For those of you just going back a few months, Professor Banzhaf was the guy recommending taking regular CPAP machines and turning them into ventilators, which turned out to be a policy. So if you want to know...
Backups for
Backups. Well, if you want to
It
know
now
a
may be
guy...
the answer, by the way, to what's happening in Africa, where some of these countries don't even have one ventilator.
Right.
Often they don't have electricity. You can use one of these portable CPAP machines. You can also get what's called an oxygen compressor or contractor,
Doc,
I guess they're called,
we
and
gotta-
run them off an automobile battery. So
All right, Doc,
that's the next big step for that
Professor,
idea.
we got to wrap it up. Stay right there. Me and Frankie wrap up Liquid Lunch with you right after this.